The city of Lagos glittered, its skyline a never-ending collection of shining steel and glass. From his penthouse office, Chuka surveyed the scene below, the chaos and opportunity of the city spread out before him. The hustle of Lagos was his arena, a place where he had fought hard for every inch of success. But even as the city thrived, the man sitting in his sleek office felt a growing emptiness within him. No amount of wealth could fill it. In a village far removed from the luxury and bustle of Lagos, Mama Adiz had raised her two children, Chuka and Adiz, with everything she had. Her husband, Chijioke, had passed away when Chuka was still a boy, leaving her alone to bear the weight of raising two children in a society that didn't value women's independence. With little support from the community, Mama Adiz had to fight for her children's future. She would wake at dawn every day to fetch water, then head to the market, where she sold local crops to the villagers. Her body ached with exhaustion, but her heart was filled with a quiet strength. Her children were her reason for living, and she would endure anything for them to have a better life. As she grew older, her muscles and joints ached from years of hard labor, but she never complained. Her sacrifices were not just physical but emotional, too. Chuka, from a young age, had been the apple of her eye. She saw in him the potential to escape the grinding poverty of the village, the promise that he would one day make it big. She pushed him hard, ensuring that he excelled in his studies. Even as her own dreams faded away in the shadow of hardship, she clung to the hope that Chuka would carry their family's legacy forward. Every meal she skipped, every hour spent working late into the night, she did it all for him. At every crossroads, Mama Adiz was his unwavering supporter, encouraging him to reach for his dreams, even when the road ahead seemed impossible. She invested all of her faith in the boy she had raised, believing that one day he would make good on his promise to take care of her. But as the years passed, Chuka grew distant. When he finally left for Lagos, he promised his mother that he would send for her once he made something of himself. "I will never forget you, Mama. I will take care of you and Adiz when I make it," he had said with sincerity, his eyes bright with hope. But those words, spoken with the fervor of a young man eager to prove himself, became just empty promises. Chuka's early years in Lagos were filled with challenges. He struggled to make ends meet, working in menial jobs to support himself. There were times when he felt like giving up, when he questioned if he would ever escape the cycle of poverty he had left behind. But Chuka was determined. He refused to let the dreams of his mother go to waste. Eventually, he found himself in the world of real estate, a career that seemed to offer the kind of opportunity he had dreamed of. His first big break came when he invested in a rundown property, using the last of his savings. He didn't know much about construction or renovation, but he had guts, and that was enough. By sheer luck and a bit of business acumen, he turned that property around, flipping it for a huge profit. One deal led to another, and soon, he was navigating the world of high-rise buildings and luxury estates. As Chuka grew in wealth, he cut ties with the past. The boy who once struggled to buy books for school became a successful businessman with a fortune that grew daily. But success came at a price. As Chuka's wealth increased, so did his arrogance. He stopped answering his mother's calls, ignored her letters, and when he did send money, it was never enough. Adiz, his sister, remained in the village, and over the years, she witnessed their mother's heartbreak as she waited for Chuka. Mama Adiz's health began to deteriorate, but she never stopped hoping for Chuka's return. Even as she grew frail, she continued to believe that one day her son would come back to take care of her as he had promised. But Chuka's indifference grew with every passing day, and Adiz could only watch as her mother suffered in silence. Adiz had always been close to her mother, and as she watched Mama Adiz slowly wither away from neglect, the frustration in her heart grew. Adiz had always been the quiet one, the daughter who supported her mother in every way, but now, she found herself torn between her loyalty to her mother and the resentment she felt toward her brother. "Chuka has forgotten us," Adiz whispered in the dark, her hands trembling as she helped Mama Adiz into bed one night. Her mother, weak and frail, didn't respond, but Adiz knew she could see the sadness in her eyes. "Why won't he come, Mama?" Adiz would ask, but the words always fell on deaf ears. Mama Adiz's silence spoke volumes, a silent plea that she would never voice aloud. As the years wore on, Adiz grew bitter. She had once believed in her brother's promise, but with every passing year, that belief eroded. And when Mama Adiz's condition worsened, the bitterness in Adiz's heart gave way to anger. Chuka had abandoned them both, left them to fend for themselves, while he lived a life of luxury and indifference. In her final days, Mama Adiz's body failed her, and she became a shadow of the woman who had raised Chuka. Adiz took care of her, but there was a growing emptiness in the air, one that neither love nor sacrifice could fill. One night, as the room darkened, Mama Adiz's breathing grew labored, each breath coming with effort. Her skin was pale, and her hands trembled weakly as she reached out toward the dim light of the room. Her once sturdy hands now appeared fragile, as if they could no longer hold on to life. Her body was a shell, her mind growing fuzzy as her spirit tried to hold on to whatever remained of her hope. She called out for Chuka in her sleep, but each time, there was no response. It was as though her soul was clinging to a fleeting dream, a dream that slowly slipped away with each moment. Adiz, exhausted and broken, wiped her mother's forehead, but the tears in her eyes were not enough to ease the ache in her heart. "Mama, please," Adiz whispered, her voice hoarse with grief. "Please, don't go." But Mama Adiz remained silent, her eyes closed, her once vibrant spirit now tired and weary. As the days stretched into one long, painful wait, Mama Adiz's health continued to decline. Her body, too frail to fight, gave in to the years of hardship. On the final night, as Adiz sat by her side, Mama Adiz gently squeezed her daughter's hand, her eyes searching for something beyond the room. "I waited for you, Chuka," she whispered in a voice barely audible. "I waited, but you never came." Tears blurred Adiz's vision, and she held her mother tighter. "I'm here, Mama. I'm here." But it wasn't enough. In that quiet, final moment, Mama Adiz let go, her spirit leaving the earthly realm with one last, sorrowful sigh. Her last breath was more than just a release from suffering, it was the final, irreversible consequence of years of unfulfilled promises and abandonment. Chuka sat at his desk, the phone pressed against his ear, staring at the paperwork scattered before him. The business calls had been endless today, but nothing compared to the weight of the letter in his hands, the letter from Adiz, telling him that Mama Adiz was dead. His eyes had scanned the words, but they hadn't quite sunk in. Mama Adiz was gone, and he hadn't even been there. He hadn't even made it back to the village to see her. He had promised, hadn't he? Promised that once he made it, once he was successful, he would return for her, take care of her. But instead, he had allowed his wealth and ambition to swallow him whole, leaving his mother behind, forgotten. He thought back to the funeral, the small, quiet affair that took place without him. He had ignored the calls. Adiz's pleas had gone unanswered. The guilt tried to settle in, but he quickly shoved it aside, burying it beneath the busy work of his life. He couldn't afford to let it distract him, not now. Later that evening, the phone rang again. This time, it was Adiz. He answered, knowing what was coming. "Chuka," Adiz's voice was thick with emotion, "you didn't even come back for her funeral. How could you do that? She raised you, Chuka. She loved you." Chuka's response was calm, perhaps too calm. "I'm sorry, Adiz. I had work, I couldn't leave everything behind." There was a long pause on the other end. Then Adiz's voice, shaky with anger and hurt, broke through the silence. "You broke your promise, Chuka." Mama Adiz died alone. Do you even care? Did you even care enough to be there when she needed you most? Chuka's jaw clenched. He had heard this all before, over and over. It was the same guilt trip, the same blame he had avoided for years. But now, it was undeniable. He had failed. I can't keep doing this, Adiz, he said, his tone cold. You're still living in the past. I'm trying to build a future here. Adiz's voice cracked, but she didn't back down. A future you're building on the broken promises of the past. Do you even realize the consequences of what you've done? The curse she laid on you? Chuka froze. The mention of a curse, a mother's curse, sounded ridiculous. It had to be nonsense, right? You really believe that nonsense, Adiz? Chuka's voice grew more dismissive. You honestly think she cursed me? That's absurd. I don't have time for this. But Adiz wasn't done. Her words were slow, deliberate, and filled with the kind of anguish that Chuka could never ignore. You will never escape this. The curse of neglect, of abandonment. You will never find peace. You'll see, Chuka. Everything you have now, everything you've built, it's all part of the price you'll pay. Chuka felt a shiver run down his spine, but he quickly shook it off. He couldn't allow himself to believe it. The curse was just a story, an excuse for the things Adiz couldn't fix. He gave one final, dismissive laugh. I don't believe in curses, Adiz. This is just your grief talking. There was a heavy silence before Adiz finally spoke again, her voice broken and raw. You'll regret this, Chuka. Mark my words. He hung up, a pang of guilt still lingering in his chest, but he quickly pushed it away. The weight of his success, the wealth, the career, everything he had worked for, was all that mattered now. But deep down, something gnawed at him, something that felt all too real. Adiz's words. The curse. Chuka glanced at the clock and shook his head, brushing the thoughts aside. He had work to do. There was no time for nonsense, no time for regrets. Chuka's success came fast and in waves. He had built his business empire from the ground up, moving from a struggling young entrepreneur to a renowned businessman in Lagos. His investments flourished, his influence expanded, and before long, he had become a household name in the real estate corporate world. Money was never a problem, his wealth opened doors, granted him access to exclusive circles, and secured his position among the elite. With his success came love. Amarachi was everything he had dreamed of in a woman, elegant, intelligent, and fiercely independent. But what truly drew him to her was something deeper, something familiar. She carried a quiet strength, the same resilience his mother had once possessed, the ability to endure hardships with grace, to sacrifice without complaint. Her unwavering belief in him reminded him of the woman he had once left behind. Their courtship was brief but intense, as though fate itself had woven their paths together. When they finally wed in a lavish ceremony that had the entire city talking, Chuka felt invincible. Life, it seemed, had rewarded him for his hard work. He had everything. But success is a fragile thing. The cracks in Chuka's perfect life began subtly, almost unnoticeable at first. A failed business deal here, an unexpected setback there. He dismissed them as normal fluctuations in the business world. After all, wasn't success just a series of wins and losses? He had overcome worse before, this was nothing. But as the misfortunes piled up, a nagging thought began to creep into his mind. Was this just bad luck, or something more? He found himself remembering his mother's final words, the curse she had spoken in her moment of heartbreak. Could it be that her spirit was reaching out from beyond, ensuring he felt the same pain he had caused her? He shook the thought away, unwilling to give in to superstition. Yet, in the dead of night, when all was silent, the question refused to leave him, was this karma, or was it his mother's vengeance? Then came the lawsuits for breaches of contract, deals that had been solid suddenly turning to dust. His partners became hesitant, reluctant to invest further. Rumors swirled around him, whispers of misfortune, of a curse. Chuka laughed it off, unwilling to believe in superstition. Amarachi, however, was worried. "There's something wrong, Chuka," she said one night as they sat in their luxurious home. "This isn't normal." Chuka scoffed, sipping his whiskey. "It's business, my love. Nothing is ever predictable." But Amarachi wasn't convinced. And neither was fate. Then came the most devastating blow of all. Amarachi had been 7 months pregnant when it happened. Their first child. They had already chosen a name, Obina. Chuka had dreamed of raising his son to take over the empire he had built, to secure the legacy he had fought so hard for. But fate had other plans. The night of the tragedy, Amarachi had woken up screaming. Chuka had rushed to her side, only to find her drenched in sweat, clutching her stomach in agony. Something was wrong. The hospital had been a blur of voices, bright lights, and panic. The doctors worked tirelessly, but in the end, there was nothing they could do. Their son was stillborn. Amarachi wept uncontrollably, clutching onto Chuka as waves of sorrow crashed over them. Chuka, numb and in shock, could barely process the moment. They had prepared everything for Obina, his nursery, his clothes, his future. Now, all of it felt like a cruel joke. The weight of grief was unbearable, suffocating them both in a silence that stretched for days. Chuka stayed by Amarachi's side, watching her suffer in ways he could do nothing to fix. He held her as she cried herself to sleep, listened to her whisper apologies to the child they lost, and felt the deep ache of helplessness settle in his chest. For the first time in years, he thought of his mother. Of how she must have suffered alone, waiting for him to return, longing for comfort that never came. A fresh wave of guilt crashed over him. Had he been so blind? He had left his mother to endure her pain alone, and now, watching Amarachi break before his eyes, he realized this was the very same pain his mother had once carried. The curse. The thought gnawed at him. Was this his punishment? To witness suffering and be unable to change it? He tried to shake the idea away, but it lingered, weaving itself into his grief, refusing to let go. After Obina's death, everything changed. Chuka was no longer the confident man he once was. Sleep became a battle. Whenever he closed his eyes, he saw shadows moving in the corners of his room, heard whispers in the dead of night. His business empire continued to collapse, one misfortune after another. His most trusted partners abandoned him, his deals crumbled before his eyes, and even his most loyal employees turned their backs on him. Amarachi became distant, retreating into a shell of sorrow and silence. Their once perfect marriage deteriorated into cold conversations and empty stares. She blamed him. She never said it aloud, but Chuka saw it in her eyes. "You should have gone back," she finally said one night, her voice barely above a whisper. "You should have been there, for your mother." Chuka's blood ran cold. He had spent years ignoring that guilt, convincing himself that his actions had no consequences. But the weight of Adi's words now clung to him like a curse he could no longer deny. And then, the nightmares began. He would wake up drenched in sweat, the sensation of invisible hands gripping his throat. The whispers grew louder. He started seeing a figure at the foot of his bed, a woman, shrouded in darkness, her presence suffocating. One night, he woke to a voice so familiar yet so chilling, it sent ice through his veins. "You abandoned me, Chuka. Now, you will know how it feels." The fall was rapid, merciless. It started with whispers, rumors of financial troubles, of deals gone bad. The worst of them all came from someone he had once considered a brother, his most trusted business partner, Tund. Chuka had built his empire with him, believing they shared the same vision, the same hunger for success. But when the cracks in Chuka's business began to show, Tund saw an opportunity, not to help, but to take. Chuka discovered too late that Tund had been siphoning funds, slowly bleeding the company dry. He had forged documents, manipulated contracts, and, when Chuka confronted him, simply smiled. "This is business, my friend," Tund had said. "It's nothing personal." But to Chuka, it was deeply personal. It was betrayal in its rawest form, a knife buried in his back by the one person he had trusted most. The worst part wasn't even the financial ruin, it was the way Tund walked away without a shred of remorse, leaving Chuka to drown in the wreckage. The pain of this treachery twisted something inside him. In Tund's cold dismissal, Chuka saw himself, how he had once turned his back on his mother without hesitation, without guilt. He wondered if she had felt the same way he did now, shattered, discarded, as though all those years of love and sacrifice had meant nothing. Regret clawed at his soul, but it was too late. His empire was crumbling, and he was powerless to stop it. Cracks widened. Investors withdrew their support, his businesses suffered losses, and soon, lawsuits came pouring in. A fraud allegation surfaced, and before he could even mount a defense, his accounts were frozen. One by one, his assets were seized, first the luxury cars, then the mansions, until there was nothing left but debt and disgrace. Then came the ultimate betrayal, Amarachi. She had tried. She had fought for their marriage, clinging to the hope that the man she once loved would return to her. But the walls between them had grown too thick, their sorrow too heavy. She had watched Chuka slip further into despair, refusing to acknowledge his mistakes, refusing to see the ghosts that now surrounded him. One night, she sat across from him, her eyes hollow with exhaustion. "Chuka," she whispered, "I can't do this anymore." He barely looked at her. He had nothing left to say. The next morning, she was gone. No grand farewell, no dramatic outburst, just a letter on the nightstand, ink smudged with the weight of tears. In it, she wrote of her pain, her love, and the regret that would haunt her forever. And as Chuka read her final words, a chill ran through him. He was truly alone now. She packed her bags and left without a word, the pain in her eyes saying more than she ever could. He had failed her. He had failed himself. Now, Chuka sat alone in a small, empty apartment, nothing left but memories and the ever-growing whispers of his past. For the first time in his life, he was truly afraid.